The contract came through a broker named Fessel, which told me two things before I even read the terms. The job was something no reputable house would touch, and somebody up the chain had enough reach to know that Fessel's clients asked no questions worth remembering. I'd done 3 hauls through him before. Or manifests. A crate of unlicensed med supplies going to a colony the protectorate had written off. Nothing I'd lose sleep over. I read the new contract standing at the galley counter of the Ardent Claws, a mug of bad reconstituted coffee in my hand, the kind that goes cold while you're still reading. Transport of 1 biological unit, non-hostile designation, juvenile classification. Origin, processing facility on Geth Mora. Destination, a depot on the moon Calest. Compensation, 4 times my standard freight rate. Do not open the container. Do not communicate with the contents. I want to be honest with you about what I thought in that moment. I didn't think, this is wrong. I thought, 4 times rate is the price for something somebody doesn't want anyone talking about. I thought, the container provision is strange, but brokers put strange provisions in contracts all the time because clients are paranoid and paranoid clients pay well. I thought, Calest is 18 transit days, and I needed the fuel credit to clear my dock fees on Meyerhan Station, or they'd impound the clause on my next return. I thought all the wrong things and I signed. The container came aboard at Geth Mora's secondary port in the early part of the morning shift, when the loading bays were thin on supervision, and the dock crews worked fast and incurious. 2 handlers in plain gray brought it on a grav sled. Standard cargo shell on the outside, the kind you'd use for sensitive electronics or climate-sensitive biologicals. Stenciled manifest numbers, nothing else. They secured it in the forward hold and left without a word. I stood in the hold after they were gone and looked at it. The container was about the size of a packing crate for a mid-range atmospheric processor. The locking mechanism was external, keyed to Fessel's broker code, which meant I couldn't open it even if I chose to violate the contract. There was a ventilation port on each side, fitted with baffles that let air move but blocked any real view of the interior. There was a humidity port with an auto-regulating valve. There were 2 small access panels on the front face, recessed, sealed. The whole thing hummed faintly, which meant it had internal climate control drawing from a power cell. You put climate control in a crate of electronics when you care about temperature. You put ventilation baffles in a container when whatever's inside needs to breathe. I went back to the cockpit and plotted the transit to Calest. 18 days through 2 relay corridors and 1 stretch of open drift. I filed my manifest, cargo, sensitive biological specimens, standard code, and took the claws up off Geth Mora without looking back at the dock. For 6 hours, I didn't go back to the hold. I made myself busy. The claws needed a fuel cell check after takeoff, and I did it. I ran the navigational calibration sequence I'd been putting off for 2 weeks. I ate something from the galley that I couldn't tell you the taste of. I sat in the cockpit and watched the stars and listened to the drive do what drives do, and I did not think about what was in the forward hold, which was the same as thinking about it continuously. I've run cargo most of my adult life. I started on bulk haulers when I was 20, running mineral ore between the outer belt stations for a cooperative that paid just above subsistence and expected the difference to be made up in silence about whatever else moved through the holds. By the time I was 30, I'd saved enough to put a down payment on the claws, a mid-size freight runner, nothing glamorous, a vessel that had been through 3 previous owners and smelled like it, and I'd been independent since. I was 44 years old when I signed Fessel's contract. I'd made my peace with most of what I'd done to keep the ship flying. I told myself the peace had been honestly earned. At hour 7, I went back to the hold. I don't know what I was going to do. Check the container's power readings, maybe. Make sure the climate system was running steady. Responsible cargo management. That was what I told myself. I stood in the hold and I listened. At first, nothing. The hum of the climate cell, the low subharmonic of the claw's drive working through the decking. Then, and it was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it, a sound from inside the container. Not a cry, not a knock or a call, a single, small exhalation. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding very still for a long time and have to breathe. I left the hold again. I sat in the cockpit. I looked at the stars going by. I thought, it's a juvenile. The contract said juvenile classification. That was the word they used. Not child, juvenile. The same word you put in a manifest for a young specimen of a protected species, or a subadult animal being moved between facilities. The same word that makes the thing being moved sound less like a person. I thought about the broker code on the lock, and the provision about not communicating with the contents. Then I thought about the 4 times rate. Then I stopped thinking about the 4 times rate, because something had shifted in the back of my mind, and I couldn't find a comfortable position that put it to rest. I went back to the hold the 3rd time with a cutting torch. The broker lock was a standard vessel-grade security module, not sophisticated, built for contractual compliance rather than actual resistance. I burned through the external casing in 4 minutes, pulled the relay board, and the locking bolts disengaged with a soft thud. I stood there with the torch still warm in my hand and the lid unsealed, and I took a breath. Then I lifted it. The child was sitting up. Not lying down, not curled in a corner. Sitting. Back straight, small hands folded in their lap, looking directly at the opening as if they had been waiting for precisely this moment, and had decided the most dignified response to it was to simply be upright and composed. The species was Veth. I placed them by the skin tone and the structure of the face before I consciously thought about it. A pale sage green, the color of old copper in humid air, with a faint luminescence under the surface that wasn't quite a glow, more the quality of light passing through shallow water. Their eyes were large and very dark, the irises a deep amber ringed in a thin line of silver, and they were looking at me with an expression I can only describe as careful. Not hopeful, not frightened. Careful. The way a person who has learned to read situations quickly learns to read them before committing to a reaction. They were small, slight in the way children are when they've been short on food for a while, not starved, not obviously unwell, but not quite solid either. They wore a plain garment, grayish-white, the kind of coarse-woven fabric institutional facilities use, because it is cheap and washable. It was too large for them. They had belted it at the waist with a strip of fabric that looked like it had been torn from the hem and retied. The container had a folded thermal sheet in the corner, a small sealed water ration, and nothing else. We looked at each other. I don't know what I expected. I had not let myself think past opening the container, which was probably a coping mechanism. Now I was here, at the end of the only plan I'd had, and there was a child in front of me, real, present, watching me with amber eyes in a dimly lit hold. And I had to be the one who said something first because I was the adult, and that was the arrangement. I said, "You've been in there since Geth Mora." They didn't answer. I didn't know if they spoke trade common, which was all I had. I didn't know if they spoke at all. Veth were not a species I'd encountered often. I knew they were from one of the mid-cluster colonies, that their home system had been under a disputed territorial claim for the better part of a decade, and that the dispute had the kind of paperwork behind it that makes people disappear into bureaucratic categories while courts move slowly. I said, "I'm going to get you some real food, and you can sit somewhere that isn't a box." They uncrossed their legs, stood up, stepped out of the container with a steadiness that surprised me, given how long they'd been confined. Then they looked at the hold, at the other cargo, the tie-downs, the grating on the decking, the scratched walls of the claws, and looked back at me. "This way," I said. They followed me to the galley. I made what passed for a meal on the claws, reheated protein block, a portion of compressed vegetable mix that was more edible than it looked, a cup of warm grain broth that the galley system optimistically called nourishing. I set it on the small table, and the child sat across from it and ate with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of someone who has learned not to trust that a meal will last long or that another will follow. They didn't speak, not that sitting. I sat across from them and drank my cold coffee and didn't push it. Afterward, they looked at me again with those amber eyes, and the expression that I was beginning to understand was their default mode, a kind of watchful, suspended assessment, like they were running calculations and hadn't finished. I said, "My name is Dario. This is my ship. You're on it for about 18 more days." "Nothing. I'm going to figure out what to do," I said. "That's going to take me a bit." They looked at me for a long moment. Then they looked at the table. Then, with a small, precise motion, they put their fingertip on the table's surface and drew a single short line in a trace of condensation from the broth cup. One line, then another perpendicular, across. I said, "I don't know what that means." They considered this. Then they made a gesture I recognized, palm up, fingers curled inward. A question. In Veth gestural language, as far as I understood it, it meant approximately, "And you?" "And I what?" Another gesture, index finger pointing at me, then the same curled palm. "My name," I said. "I told you, Dario." They shook their head, "Not that." I thought for a moment, what I'm going to do. The curled palm again, waiting. "I'm going to figure it out," I said again. They looked at me steadily. Then they made a different gesture, both palms flat, pressed together, then slowly separated. Something between, in between, not decided. "Yeah," I said. "That's about right." I gave them the crew bunk. There was no crew, hadn't been for 2 years. I ran the claws alone and had since my co-pilot Senna left to take a permanent position on a station freighter with a pension track and regular hours, which I'd understood and not entirely forgiven. The bunk was small but horizontal and private, which was an improvement on the container by any measure. I went back to the cockpit, and I sat with the controls and the transit map and the slow drift of stars, and I thought for the rest of that sleep cycle. Here is what I knew by morning. Callist was not a depot. I'd known that somewhere in the back of my mind when I signed the contract, and had successfully not examined it. I pulled the station registry on Callist now, and looked at it without the comfortable blur of not looking. The listed facility was a staging operation registered to a holding company called Meridian Transfer Solutions, which was 3 layers of incorporation away from a trafficking network that the Protectorate's Bureau of Commerce had opened and closed 2 investigations into without producing charges. The Bureau's investigators had the kind of success rate that suggests the investigators and the investigated have a productive relationship. The child was Veth. The Veth home system was under territorial dispute, which meant the population's legal status was in a gray area that people with money and lawyers had been exploiting for 11 years to move Veth people through the gaps in interstellar protection law. Children especially. Children were portable. Children were quiet, mostly. Children were valuable to a certain class of operation for reasons I was not willing to articulate in any detail even to myself. I looked at the transit map, and then I looked at the alterations I'd need to file to change my course. Then I thought about Fessel. Fessel was not the top of this. Fessel was never the top of anything. But Fessel had clients I didn't know the names of, and those clients had reach I hadn't measured, and I had made the mistake once before of assuming I understood the full dimensions of a situation I was inside. I had the child on my ship. I had 18 days of transit, and somewhere in those 18 days there was going to be a decision I couldn't unmake. I went to check on the child. They were awake, sitting cross-legged on the bunk, looking at nothing in particular. When I appeared in the doorway, they turned to look at me with that same careful amber attention. I said, "I'm going to need to know your name." They considered me for a moment. Then, slowly and with clear deliberation, they pressed 2 fingers to their sternum. That's your name, I said. They pressed 2 fingers to their sternum again, then held up the same 2 fingers and looked at them for a moment, then looked at me. I said too, is that what it means, or is it a sound? They closed their eyes briefly, opened them, made the gesture one more time, then held up 2 fingers and moved them in a small, specific rhythm, not a number, a cadence, 2 beats. 2 beats, I said then. Veth naming conventions, a name is a rhythm, isn't it? Something shifted in their face, just slightly. Not a smile, too controlled for a smile, but the calculation in their eyes changed register. I said, I'll call you Tiv, 2 beats if that works. They looked at me, then they nodded once. That was the first response, that was clearly a yes. Everything before had been suspended, carefully neutral. The nod was small but unambiguous. I stored it like something valuable and went back to the cockpit. 3 days passed. Tiv did not wander the ship. They stayed in the bunk space or came to the galley at meals, which I began to time deliberately, the same interval each cycle, so they could expect them. I'd read once that predictability is the first form of care for a person who has spent time in systems that were unpredictable and unkind. I didn't know if that was true. It seemed like a decent operating principle. I noticed other things. They were meticulous about the bunk space. The thermal sheet folded, the pillow positioned the same way, nothing left out of place that hadn't been that way when they found it. Whether that was their nature or the instinct of someone who had learned not to leave evidence of occupation, I couldn't say. Probably both. I didn't remark on it. I just made sure there was a clean surface in the galley for them to work with when they ate and let them have what order they could build in the corner of a stranger's ship. They ate everything I put in front of them. They drank water steadily. The sage green of their skin looked less worn by the second day. The luminescent quality underneath it had strengthened slightly, which I thought was probably a health indicator, though I had no medical reference for Veth physiology, and the clause's med system had been calibrated for human parameters. They watched me work. When I was at the navigation console, they would appear in the cockpit doorway and stand there for minutes at a time, not asking to come in, just observing. After the first time I said, "You can come in if you want," they came in and sat on the co-pilot seat, Senna's old seat, and watched the stars and my hands on the controls with equal attention. They did not touch anything they hadn't been invited to touch. They didn't break anything. They didn't ask for anything they hadn't been offered. They moved through the clause with a thoughtfulness that sat awkwardly on a child, or rather, it sat exactly right on this child, who had clearly been in enough situations where taking too much space was dangerous that they had made themselves small as a habit. I started talking, because the silence was one thing and the weight of the silence was another. I talked about the clause, its history, the repairs I'd made, the systems that still ran unreliably and why I hadn't fixed them, which was mostly money and partly stubbornness. I talked about the transit corridors and the physics of the relay beacons, and how you could navigate without them if you had to, but it added days and required calculations that gave you a headache. I talked about the other cargo I was carrying, legitimate manifest items, machine parts for a farming cooperative on a colony called Yenthas Prime, low value, low drama. Tiv listened to all of it. Sometimes they nodded. Sometimes they made the open palm question gesture, and I'd expand on whatever I'd been saying. Once when I was explaining how the drive compensators worked, they reached past me very carefully and touched the labeled switch on the panel, looked at me, and raised an eyebrow. "That one controls the pressure differential in the secondary coolant loop," I said. "Don't flip it while we're in transit. Nothing will explode, but we'll lose coolant efficiency, and I'll spend an hour fixing it." They withdrew their hand. The eyebrow stayed up. "You can flip it when we're docked sometime," I said, "if you're still curious." They looked at me steadily for a moment. Then they looked at the stars ahead. "I thought, if you're still with me when we're docked. If I have a plan by then, that puts you somewhere safe instead of where you were going." I thought, what I'm doing by feeding this child and talking to them and giving them a name and saying, sometime, is building something that has a shape, and shapes carry obligations. I thought you already knew that, Dario. That's why you opened the container. On day 4, Fessel sent a message. It came through the broker's standard channel, encrypted, tagged as routine. I read it alone at the console. It said, routine transit inquiry, confirm position and ETA. Standard stuff. But attached to the routine text, in a secondary field that required a specific decryption key to read, was a shorter message. It said, cargo confirmed viable at loading. Do not tamper with environmental controls. Broker code lock must remain intact for handover authentication. Any evidence of container breach will void contract and trigger liability provisions. Confirm acknowledgement. I read that twice. Broker code lock must remain intact for handover authentication, which meant the people receiving the cargo at Calest were going to verify that the container hadn't been opened, which meant they were expecting a child who had been in a sealed box for 18 days, which told me everything about what kind of operation I was looking at and what they thought of the thing they'd asked me to transport. I sat with the console for a long time. Through the port above the navigation board, the stars moved in their slow, indifferent way, and the claws ran quiet, and somewhere aft of me a child was in the crew bunk doing whatever they did in the hours I wasn't with them. Learning the ship's sounds, probably, cataloging exits, reading the rhythm of the drive and the intervals of my movements the same way they'd been reading me across every meal and every hour in the cockpit. They had been doing that since the moment I opened the container. Building a model of their situation, understanding it with the precision of someone who had learned that understanding was a survival skill. I had signed a contract and pocketed the moral question of what the contract was for. That was what I had done. I had let the 4 times rate be loud enough to drown out the things I'd already known and chosen not to examine. The container provision, the Calest destination, the word juvenile on a trafficking manifest. I knew what I knew when I read those terms. I made a choice to call it ambiguous. I didn't reply to Fessel's message. That was a mistake I'd have to manage later. I sat with the console and looked at the stars and felt something settle in my chest into a shape I recognized from 2 or 3 other moments in my life. The shape of a decision that was going to cost me something and was going to happen anyway. I found Tiv in the bunk space, sitting with their knees drawn up, looking at the wall. I sat on the edge of the bunk. They looked at me. I said, the people who paid to put you on this ship, they're waiting for you at the other end, and they're not good people. Tiv's expression didn't change. This information was not new to them. I'm not going to take you there, I said. They looked at me carefully. The amber eyes moved over my face, reading something in it. Then they made a gesture I hadn't seen before, fingers of one hand overlapping the back of the other hand held steady. It was a Veth gesture I didn't know. I shook my head. They thought about this for a moment, then they held up one finger. One, then they pointed at me. One person, I said. They nodded. One person, me, I'm the one person who, I stopped. Who's making this decision? They shook their head, not that either. One finger, me. Then they brought both hands together, interlaced the fingers. I looked at that for a long moment. The only person, I said slowly, who is. I stopped and thought about it from a different angle. The only person who has. They waited. I'm the only person, I said, who has done something. They tilted their head. Who has, and then I understood. Who has shown up, I said. I'm the only one who showed up. Tiv looked at me without the carefulness for just a second. 1 second, unguarded. Then the carefulness was back, but underneath it was something I didn't have a precise word for except that it wasn't calculation anymore. I said, that's a low bar. They looked at me steadily. I said, I'm going to clear it anyway. There were 14 days of transit remaining. I used them. The first problem was Fessel and the network behind Fessel. I had gone silent on their communication channel, which would register as a fault on their end after 48 hours. Equipment trouble was plausible, but not indefinitely. When the silence stretched past that window, whoever was monitoring would start asking questions about the Ardent Clause and its cargo, and the questions would arrive at Callast ahead of me, or they'd try to intercept me somewhere in the transit corridor. The second problem was the Ardent Clause herself. My ship was registered under my name and operator license, my dock records were public, my usual trade corridors were documented. I was not a difficult target to find or follow if someone had motivation and a database. The third problem was where to take Tiv. I worked the third problem first, because it was the one I had the least control over, and I wanted to understand its edges before I started moving. The Protectorate was not an option. The Protectorate's Bureau of Resettlement had a VETH intake process that had been running at 4 to 6 years for basic status determination, during which time the child would go into a holding facility, which was not a trafficking operation, but was also not a home, not a school, not anything a child should spend 4 to 6 years inside. I knew someone who tried that route once for a VETH adult they'd pulled out of a bad situation. The adult was still in the intake system, the last I'd heard. There were 3 VETH diaspora networks operating in the mid-cluster. One was a political advocacy organization that did good work and had no physical infrastructure for children. One was a religious community on a small station near the Hesse relay that I'd heard of but never contacted. One was a mutual aid network run partly by VETH who'd gotten out and partly by people like me, independent operators, people on the margins of legitimate freight work who moved things through gaps, because the gaps were where the people who needed help also lived. I knew one name in that third network. A woman named Asha Delvar, who ran a small goods trading operation out of a station called Mast Anchor, and who had, on 2 occasions, asked me to carry certain containers on the same legitimate-looking manifest I used for everything else, and drop them at coordinates that didn't correspond to any registered facility. I'd done it twice and asked no questions. She'd paid in fuel credit, and I'd been grateful and gone on my way. I sent Delvar a message, encrypted through a personal relay channel she'd given me on our second interaction with the instruction to use it for nothing except emergencies. The message was 11 words. I have a VETH child, I need a place, reply fast. Then I went back to the console and started working on the Fessel problem. The clause had a secondary transponder installed by a previous owner, not strictly legal, a ghost identifier that could stand in for my registration under certain conditions. I'd used it twice, both times with misgivings, both times in situations that seemed to justify the misgiving afterward. I activated it now and changed my course. Instead of running straight to Callast, I filed a ghost manifest under the secondary transponder for a route that bent sharply toward the outer relay network. A route that looked, on paper, like a ship making an unscheduled stop at a cargo exchange station to pick up additional freight. It was plausible. It would confuse the picture for a few days while I ran the actual route I intended. The problem with ghost transponders is they create their own paper, an additional vessel showing a legitimate route, which means 2 vessels on the registry for the same ship, which means any careful analysis will find the anomaly. I was betting on the network having enough moving parts that no single person would be watching carefully enough, quickly enough. It was not a comfortable bet. Delvar responded on hour 18. Her message was 9 words. Bring them to Mast Anchor. Use the eastern dock, trust me. I held that for a long moment, then I plotted the new course. Mast Anchor was 6 days away if I used the transit corridor through the Vethis relay, which was a longer route, but avoided the 2 stations I estimated were most likely to have Fessel's attention. 6 days. The clause had fuel for 8 without resupply, which was tight but workable. I was going to arrive at Mast Anchor with an irregular transponder record, a broken broker contract, a child I'd removed from a trafficking container, and a ship that needed a dock badly. I'd be arriving without the 4x rate, which had never cleared because Fessel's release was tied to delivery completion. I'd be arriving having burned extra fuel on a ghost transponder route and a full power burst. I'd be arriving with outstanding dock fees on Meyerhan Station and no legitimate cargo to offset them, since the machine parts for Yenthes Prime had been on the Calest route, and I'd have to reroute or abandon the contract, which was another default on another contract, which would follow my operator license in the freight registry. I've been in worse positions. I told myself that a few times until I believed it. I told Tiv the plan. I sat with them in the galley at the meal I'd begun calling dinner, regardless of what the ship's clock said, because having a name for things creates a structure, and structure was something this child needed more than accurate timekeeping. I told them about Mast Anchor, that it was a small station, that there were people there who knew how to help Veth specifically. I told them I knew the person who was meeting us, and that she could be trusted as much as anyone in a situation like this could be trusted, which was not a guarantee but was not nothing. Tiv listened to all of it with their hands flat on the table, looking at me. When I was done, they were quiet for a moment. Then they made the gesture I'd learned by now, the curled palm, the question. "What happens to me after?" I said. Not a question. I already knew that was what they were asking. They nodded. I said, honestly, I don't know the full picture. What I know is that Delvar's network has placed kids before. That the people at Mast Anchor are not the people at Calest. Tiv looked at their hands, then they looked at me. They made a new gesture. I've been cataloging their vocabulary of movement over 6 days, and this one was unfamiliar. Both hands lifted slightly, palms toward me. Not a question. Something more like, "I'm putting this in your hands." I said, "I know that's a lot to ask of someone who's been in a box." They shook their head once. Then they made the gesture again. Both palms toward me. It wasn't resignation. It was something more deliberate than that. I said, "I'm not going to drop this. You understand that?" The carefulness in their face again, the assessment running. I said, "I have a reputation for completing contracts. Fessel will tell you I have never defaulted on a delivery. The thing nobody put in a contract before is, I get to decide what I'm delivering." Tiv looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time, they smiled. It was not a large smile. It was barely a curve at the corners of their mouth. But it was unambiguous and unguarded, and I looked away from it because it cost me something to receive, and I didn't want them to see that on my face. "Eat your dinner," I said. The next 4 days were the tense ones. Fessel's network sent 3 more messages on the main channel, escalating in formality. The first was a standard inquiry. The second was a request for position confirmation with a veiled reference to the contract's liability provisions. The third was a notification that the contract had been flagged for noncompliance, and that a field verification team had been dispatched to my last known transit corridor. A field verification team meant people in ships. How many ships and how fast they were, I didn't know. What I knew was that Fessel's clients were motivated enough to send assets, which meant the cargo was valuable enough to pursue, and that the people who ran this operation were not the kind who absorbed losses quietly. I pushed the clause harder. I'd been running at 80% drive output to conserve fuel. I ran at 95 now and watched the consumption figures and did math I didn't enjoy. Tiv noticed. They came to the cockpit on the second of those days and looked at the console and then looked at me. I said, "We're being followed. Maybe, I don't know how close." They looked at the drive output readout. They were learning the displays. I'd caught them studying them during their observation time in the co-pilot seat, and they had the kind of attention that organized information fast. They pointed at the output readout, then at me, a question. We can sustain this for about 50 more hours before I have to throttle back or we limp into mast anchor on fumes, I said. 50 hours gets us inside the Vethai's relay corridor, which has a lot of traffic. Hard to track one ship in a busy corridor. They looked at the readout for another moment. Then they pointed at the output readout again, and this time made a sharp upward gesture. Higher, I said. The hull can technically handle 100% output for short bursts. The drive can't sustain it long, and the coolant loop will be running hot. They looked at me, pointed at the output readout, then held up one finger and made a short, clear slashing motion. Once. A burst, I said. Once. They nodded. To get us inside the corridor faster. I ran the calculation in my head. A full power burn for 4 hours would put us inside the Vethai's corridor 18 hours earlier than my current trajectory. The coolant loop would need manual attention afterward. We'd arrive at mast anchor with less fuel margin than I wanted and a drive that needed servicing, but we'd arrive. I said, you worked that out yourself. They gave me the look that I was beginning to think of as their version of a shrug. The look that said, obviously, and I wasn't going to offer it unless you were stuck. You've been watching my console math, I said. They didn't deny it. I ran the burst. 4 hours at full output, the claws shaking in a way that reminded me she was 22 years old and had been through 3 owners before me. The coolant system running at the top of its tolerance and making a sound I would describe charitably as industrious and more accurately as alarmed. Tiv stayed in the co-pilot seat for the whole burn, watching the displays, and I didn't ask them to leave because having someone watching numbers I wasn't watching was useful, and because they were clearly not frightened by a ship under stress, which told me something about what they'd already been through. When the burn was done, I throttled back and went to deal with the coolant loop manually. Tiv followed me to the access panel without being asked, and held the work light where I needed it while I bled the excess pressure and reseated the regulator valve. The work took 40 minutes. They held the light steady the entire time without being asked to adjust it and without losing attention. I said from inside the access panel, "You've done maintenance work before." They didn't answer, but they adjusted the light angle slightly without being asked, which was its own answer. We were inside the Vethai's corridor by the time I'd finished. 47 ships in the corridor registry, running standard lanes. One freight runner pushing 80% output with a ghost transponder, and a Veth child in the co-pilot seat was indistinguishable from the outside. I breathed for the first time in 4 days. Mast anchor appeared on the long-range display 36 hours later. It was a small station, a working hub rather than anything cosmopolitan, the kind of place that exists to service the needs of independent freight operators and the colonies that depend on them. It had 4 docking rings, a commercial promenade that ran to about a dozen functional establishments, a fuel depot, and a repair facility that handled basic to mid-range work. The eastern dock was the quietest of the 4 rings, mostly used by small independent operators who weren't on anyone's regular route tracking. Delvar was waiting at the dock when I brought the claws in. She was a small woman, late 50s, compact and quick in the way of people who have spent decades moving through tight spaces and situations that required fast decisions. She had a Veth emblem on her jacket, not advertising it, but not hiding it either, a small pin at the collar that anyone who knew what they were looking at would recognize. She was alone, which I thought was either trust or careful security. Knowing Delvar, probably both. She had a ground crew jacket on over a plain shirt, and she was drinking something from a sealed container, which told me she'd been at the dock long enough to be thirsty and didn't intend to leave to get a proper cup. I came down the ramp and she came forward and I said, "I'm going to need fuel." "Hello to you too, Mast," she said. She called me by my ship's name, which was her habit. "The child's on board." "They're waiting," I said. "They don't know you." They don't need to know me yet, she said. They need to see me. Different thing. She walked past me to the ramp and stopped at the base of it and looked up. Tiv was at the top of the ramp. They'd been watching through the port since we docked. I was certain of that. They stood there now, small, straight, hands at their sides, the careful amber eyes taking in Delvar with the same methodical attention they gave everything. Delvar said something in Veth. I didn't understand it. I knew Veth had a spoken language that I didn't speak. I'd been working around that the whole transit. Delvar's Veth was not fluent by the sound of it, but it was real, and she pronounced it without hesitation. Tiv's expression shifted. Not the small, controlled smile they'd given me on day 6. Something different. Something that went through the carefulness straight to the thing underneath it that the carefulness had been holding in place. Their eyes stayed dry, but the set of their face changed, and they stood there for a moment at the top of the ramp with that expression on their face. And I understood that what Delvar had said was the first thing anyone had said to them in their own language in what was probably a very long time. Then Tiv walked down the ramp. They stopped next to me, not next to Delvar. They stood at my side and looked at Delvar and waited, reading the situation, checking references, you might say. I said, "She's good people, Tiv." They looked at me, the question gesture. "As sure as I can be," I said. They looked at Delvar. Delvar stood patiently, which I appreciated. She didn't rush toward the child or speak again. She waited. Then Tiv looked back at me and made the gesture I'd first seen in the galley, both palms facing me, "Putting this in your hands." But this time their face carried something additional that hadn't been there in the galley. The calculation was mostly done. The answer was mostly in. I said, "I know, go ahead." They nodded, turned to Delvar. Delvar said something else in Veth, shorter this time, and gestured toward the promenade. Tiv looked at her, then back at me. I said, "Go eat something. I have fuel to arrange and a ship to sort out." Tiv looked at me for a moment. Amber eyes, careful as always, but the carefulness had a different quality now. Less the calculation of someone reading a new environment, more the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is standing in it. Then they did something that they had not done at any point in 8 days on the claws. They put one hand on my arm briefly just above the wrist, one small hand very light, 2 seconds. Then they turned and walked with Delvar toward the promenade. I watched them go. Tiv's small figure beside Delvar's compact one, moving through the dock. I watched until they were around the corner and the dock was just a dock again. I went and arranged fuel. What happened next was less clean. I knew it wouldn't be clean. I'd been in enough situations to know that removing a piece of cargo from a trafficking network and depositing it somewhere safe does not conclude the problem. It just moves the problem to a different stage. The stage where the trafficking network has lost an asset and lost it publicly enough to be embarrassing, which is worse for them than losing it quietly. And the people who run those operations have a long institutional memory for embarrassments. Fessel sent a final message to my main channel the day after I docked at mast anchor. It was not long. It said, "You understand what you've done. You understand the provisions. The matter is with the clients now. This account is closed." Fessel washing their hands of it, which meant it was no longer a contractual dispute and had become something else, which in practical terms meant people whose names I didn't know had a grievance against me that they were going to pursue through means that weren't broker arbitration. I had a decision to make about the clause. The ship was registered in my name. My operator license was tied to it. I had a ghost transponder on record now in the Vethai's corridor, which was detectable if anyone looked carefully. The dock fees on Meyerhan Station were still outstanding. The 4 times rate payment had never been released when I'd gone silent on Fessel's channel, which I'd anticipated, which meant I'd done this job for nothing monetarily, and had arrived at the far end of it with outstanding debt, and a ship that needed maintenance, and a set of powerful, nameless people who were motivated to find me. I talked to Delvar over coffee at one of the promenade establishments, while Tiv was in the back somewhere being introduced to someone I didn't see clearly. Delvar had a setup here, a small space she called an office, which was 3 rooms above the promenade and contained a communications array, a supply cache, and 2 people I gathered were part of her network whose names she didn't offer and I didn't ask. She said, "How hot are you?" I said, "Medium. They'll track the claws eventually. The ghost transponder bought time, not a solution." She said, "Can you sell the ship?" I looked at her. "Private transaction," she said. "Someone in the network needs a freight runner. The clause goes to new ownership, new registration, different trade corridor. You get enough to cover your station debts and go quiet somewhere for a while. Maybe enough to start something smaller. The clause is 22 years old and needs a coolant system service," I said. "And she made it from Geth Mora to mast anchor through a transit corridor with people behind her," Delvar said. "That's worth something to a buyer who knows what to look for." I thought about that for a long time. The ardent clause had been mine for 14 years. She'd been through 3 owners before me, and I'd always thought of that as her history, not mine. Now I thought about what the 4th owner's chapter had been, what I'd done on her in it. I said, "There's a person in the network who needs a freight runner and knows how to run a coolant service and can handle a ship that has 1 or 2 systems that run unreliably." Delvar smiled slightly. "I might know someone." "Tell them about the coolant system," I said. "I don't want to hear later that I undersold the issue." "Dario," she said. "Tell them about the secondary drive calibration too. The starboard one drifts if you push it above 90% output for more than 4 hours." She looked at me steadily. "I'll tell them everything. Is that a yes?" I sat with my coffee. 22 years old, 3 owners before me, 14 years mine, 68 transit days last year alone. I knew every sound she made and what it meant. I knew the specific rattle of the aft cargo locks and the smell of the drive room when the coolant was running hot, and the way the navigation display flickered in the upper left corner when the ambient temperature dropped below 12 degrees. I said yes. I spent 2 days at mast anchor handling what had to be handled. The transaction for the clause went through Delvar's network, which meant it was clean in the ways that mattered and invisible in the ways that also mattered. I cleared my Meyer and Station dock fees out of the proceeds and had enough left to cover living expenses for several months somewhere modest. Delvar said she knew a station near the Tessai corridor that was quiet and small, and had work for people who asked few questions and were good at mending things. I said I was reasonably good at mending things. I saw Tiv twice more at mast anchor. The first time was at the promenade briefly. They were sitting with a woman I hadn't met, older, Veth, with the same sage-green cast to their skin but deeper with age. They were eating. Tiv looked up when I passed and watched me, and I raised a hand in acknowledgement. They made the curled palm gesture, the question, and then answered it themselves by looking at the woman beside them and then back at me in a single movement that said, "She's okay." Then they went back to eating. The second time was the morning I was leaving. I was at the eastern dock with what was left of my things, 1 bag, a few tools, the navigational slide rule I'd carried since my first bulk hauler because I was sentimental about it, and the clause was already under her new ownership, the registration change filed, and I was about to take a berth on a station transport to the Tessai corridor. Tiv appeared at the dock entrance. They were clean. Better clothed, something that fit them, simple, in a dark blue that made the sage green of their skin look healthier than the institutional gray had. They walked to where I was standing and stopped in front of me. I said, "You look better." They looked at me. I said, "Is Delvar's contact good?" The older woman. They made the gesture for yes, unambiguous. "Good," I said. Tiv looked at me for a long moment. Then they reached into the pocket of their new clothing and took out something small and held it out to me. It was a small piece of metal, a disc, about the size of a thumb with something worked into its surface. I looked at it. The marks were Veth script, which I couldn't read. It was clearly handmade, worked by someone with a basic tool and patience. It was warm from their pocket. I said, "Did you make this?" They nodded. "When did you have time to? You've been here 2 days." They gave me the look that said, "Obviously I made time." I said, "What does it say?" They thought about how to answer that without language. Then they pointed at me. Then at themselves. Then they made the interlaced hands gesture, the one they'd made in the galley on day 1, which had taken me a long time to understand. The only person who showed up. I said, "That's still a low bar." They shook their head once. Their expression was the clearest it had been in any of our 11 days. No carefulness in it at all, just clear. I closed my hand around the disc. I said, "Be well, Tiv." They reached up, they were small, it was a reach, and put their hand on my arm again, above the wrist. The same place, the same brief pressure. This time 4 seconds instead of 2. Then they turned and walked back toward the promenade. Straight-backed, deliberate, that unhurried steadiness that had been with them since the first moment they'd stood up in the container and met my eyes. I watched them go until the dock was just a dock. The transport to the Tessai corridor was called the Meridian Run, which I considered an unfortunate name and then got on anyway. I had my bag, my tools, my slide rule, and the disc in my jacket pocket. I don't know exactly what became of the network behind Fessel. I know some of it, pieces of it, the parts that made the mid-cluster freight news over the following years, which I read on stations and in transit lounges without anyone knowing I had a personal connection to the story. A Bureau of Commerce investigation that actually produced charges. Finally, after 11 years of the kind of progress that suggests someone had gotten to the investigators. The charges were not large enough or fast enough for what the operation had done, but they were real. Meridian Transfer Solutions had its licenses revoked. The Calest facility was audited. I know what I know about how things like that happen. I know Delvar and the people in her network had spent years building toward the moment when someone in the right position could act on what they knew. I know that moving cargo that nobody is supposed to know is moving leaves traces if the right person is looking. And I know that I had one job in that particular chapter of things, and I did it. Whatever came after was other people's work, and I am glad it happened. I found the station near the Tessai corridor. It was as quiet as Delvar had said, and the work was unglamorous. I spent a year doing maintenance contracts, mechanical repair, the kind of detailed close work that requires patience and a tolerance for bad lighting and awkward angles. I was reasonably good at it. The station manager was a practical woman named Autori who asked 3 questions when I arrived and none after that, which suited me. I kept the disc in my jacket pocket. I still don't read Veth script. I've met 3 people in the years since who did, and I've shown it to none of them. The words are Tiv's words, worked into metal with patience, and I figure they can stay Tiv's until I'm ready to know them, which might be a while yet. Some things you carry differently when they stay just a little outside your full understanding, when you have to hold them by what they feel like rather than what they mean exactly. I've lived long enough to know the difference between a thing you need to grasp completely and a thing that does its work on you better held at that particular angle. I heard from Delvar twice in the years after. She had a careful way of writing that conveyed information without conveying information. The craft of someone who had been working at the edges of legality for good reasons for a long time. The first message told me that a young Veth from a mid-cluster case had started working with a diaspora advocacy organization on Mast Anchor, which was not a name or a description, but was enough. The second message was shorter. Ask no questions and hear no lies, but things turned out better than they usually do. I read that second message in a transit lounge on a station near the Tessai relay, and I sat with it for a long time. A cup of coffee, gone cold. The lounge busy around me, freight operators and dock workers, and the general population of people who live in stations moving things between places. Nobody paying any attention to a man sitting with a message on a personal device and a cooling cup, and an expression they probably couldn't read. I thought about what Tiv had looked like walking away from the dock with Delvar, small and straight-backed and deliberate, in the dark blue clothes that fit them better than anything they'd worn on the claws. I thought about what they'd looked like sitting cross-legged on the bunk on day one, composed and waiting. I thought about the amber eyes in the hold when I'd lifted the container lid, taking me in without flinching. All that watchful patience on a child who had been in a sealed box and emerged from it upright. Better than they usually do. That's the thing in the end. You spend enough years moving cargo through systems built to ignore the people inside the cargo, and you learn to calibrate your expectations for outcomes. You learn to take the small wins and the partial victories and count them honestly, because the alternative is bitterness, and bitterness is just a slow way of conceding. Better than they usually do, and I was there for the part I was there for. I finished my coffee, got up, had a ship to catch. Some habits don't break even when the ship is someone else's now.